So welcome back, everyone. I think we've still got a few more people jumping in, but we'll go ahead and just get started. This first question, and any questions you have throughout the rest of this call for the 30 minutes we have today, just drop it in the chat. And we will be, either Dan or myself, Logan couldn't join us this time, but we'll be looking in the chat, and we will try to answer. If we don't answer your question on this call, we'll get it in the doc. That way we can answer it on future calls. But the first question is what metrics to consider and track for success? I know, Dan, this is something I think we touched on a little bit last week, but do you want to jump in and tackle this question? I know we get it a lot.
Sure. There's like multiple, I'm not sure what list you're working from for these questions, but I can answer this one for sure. When it comes to measuring podcast success, it's kind of difficult, right? Because you're only given a set list of podcast analytics. You log into your Libsyn or Sounder or whatever analytics dashboard you have, and you see some downloads. It's like, yeah, and then you publish again, you see some more downloads, and hopefully they're more than last time. The problem is you're like, well, are these good? Are these bad? Most of us have been working with websites and blog posts long enough to kind of know that, 5 people reading a blog post isn't that great. That 250 is getting pretty good. And if you're in the thousands, and you're doing really good, right? But in podcasting, you're like, what are the benchmarks we can look at? So here's a couple of ways you can actually determine what to look at in your podcast analytics. One, to compare apples to apples to itself, to your other channels, and then to the industry. Those are kind of the 3 different ways to provide enough context to know if your podcast is successful. When comparing podcast analytics to itself, what I really like to look at, are you seeing rising totals with each new episode within the first couple of days, right? That kind of shows how many new subscribers you have. Unlike YouTube and podcasting, you don't get to be told how many subscribers you have. Apple and Spotify keep that a mystery from you. You do not get to know how many people have actually tapped that subscribe button, but you can see how many times it's being pulled when you first release it. So that kind of tells you what it is from all the different platforms. I want to see that number going up each time, or at least on average. Some will go up, some will go down, but is that going up? You also want to take a look at your total downloads or listeners for the month. And that's because your back catalog of episodes will continue to get download, and that will continue to make up a bigger and bigger piece.
She said she's going to call Comcast.
Oh, somebody needs to hit mute. So you need to look at that as well. Those are the 2 places to look at if your podcast is doing well within podcasting itself. Outside of podcasting, just comparing it to your other channels, I like to look at minutes consumed. Is it getting as many minutes consumed as a blog post? The fun thing about a podcast is that you're consuming way more minutes, right? Somebody's listening to you for 30 to 40 minutes. That's a lot of engagement. If you take that same engagement and compare it apples to apples with blog post, you're probably getting 5-7 minutes at best with a long blog post. So just know that it probably won't get the same reach as a blog post, because it can't get found in many ways, but the engagement is deeper. So in order to compare more apples to apples, you want to compare consumption metrics like minutes consumed. And the last one is industry benchmarks. We actually just published a blog post just showcasing what we've been able to learn after launching 100 plus podcasts, of where you can expect, if you're in the B2B space, you can expect to be in like month 1, 6 months in, year in, all the way up to 2 years in. We've had a number of different podcasts we've managed. So we've kind of pulled those all together to pull averages for where most B2B podcasts are, at least if they're working with us.
You remember off the top of your head, Dan, what some of those numbers are? I want to say it was like in the first 30 days, was it around like 50? Do you have those off the top of your head?
Not off the top of my head, but I could pull it up real quick. It's just in our most recent blog post here.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No problem. So within 30 days, you can expect about 50 downloads. In 90 days, you're looking at about 150 to 200, 180 days, 200, a year in, about 400 on average, and 2 years in, around the 800 plus if you've been doing well. And that's what you can expect to be seeing downloads of each episode.
Nice.
And I'll link that and put it in the chat for more, for like a elaboration of everything I just said.
Yeah, MEK just dropped it in the chat too, so that blog post is there. If you guys want to, if anybody wants to check that out. This next one, next question.
Sorry to disturb you.
No, you're good.
Could I just add something onto that? What I've seen people do is when they actually use a landing page with a CTA to share it through their emails, or you can even do it through social media, then what you could do is you can see the site traffic that's coming onto your landing page. You can see the number of email signups, for example, the open rates on that. And for example, you can see the engagement rates on your social media channels, like the shares and then the comments. And then of course, there's people who refer that link to someone else. Those are some other ways that you can track it as well, which is outside the podcast itself.
Yep. Colin, you left a comment that said success can also be determined by the content your podcast creates and the engagement generated from that content. Colin, did you want to elaborate on that at all? I would, I don't know if you're wanting to unmute or if you're just in a spot where you can't talk, Colin, but I would say that I absolutely agree with that. The content we've created a lot of content through our show, B2B Growth, that then splinters off and turns into LinkedIn content that we use. So Logan, Dan, and I will jump on a behind the curtain episode, for example. We'll be talking through a new methodology that we've developed or some scorecard or model that we're using as it relates to B2B podcasting. We'll record the episode. We'll send it over to our writing team, MEK, who's on this call. She'll turn it into a blog post. And then a lot of times, Dan, Logan, and myself will look at that blog post and we'll be able to pull different LinkedIn status updates. We'll end up getting way more traction. You know, our podcast has quite a bit of reach. Each episode gets about 2,000 downloads, but when each of us post something on LinkedIn about it, Dan will get, 10,000 views on his LinkedIn status about it. I'll get, 10 or 15,000 views. Logan, similar. And so you look at the impact of that piece of content goes far beyond the 2,000 people we reach that are subscribed to our show. And you start to see that it can go bananas on other platforms, particularly LinkedIn, because the organic reach is so crazy right now. Colin just commented, he said, sorry, too loud here to unmute. Hashtag work from home. Awesome. So any other thoughts here from anybody on the call around measurement and how you've measured success of your show? Awesome. Well, this next question, it's from Peter Murphy Lewis, and he said, are there any SOPs, standard operating procedures, that would make things faster or easier or more consistent? Rob, I dropped you a direct message on here. Feel free to say no, but with you being a producer on our team and relatively new to the team, having a show before you joined our team, are there any particular standard operating procedures that you either had before you joined the team or after you joined the team that have been really, really helpful for you?
You guys are going to laugh because everybody who works for Sweetfish is going to know I beat the drum of build a queue. And that if there is one rule I basically have for every single of our customers that works with me, and the first thing I say to them is, if you're going to have your podcast produced by me, the number one thing we need to do is build a queue. And the other part of that is almost batch creation as well, of you need to get a day and you need to schedule 2, 3, 4 interviews maybe. Man, it's going to be a whole evening. Seriously, I've gotten out of Sweetfish and literally podcasted until 11 p.m. with guests for my show. And it's really great because when you are bringing things through in kind of a clump, it not only lets you kind of, specialize that. We all know that if you specialize in something with a task or something like that is often more easily repeatable, but also, again, back to the queue part, you're able to build this buffer is the best word I can use, where you're not just trying to figure out, oh my God, I have a show to launch on Wednesday and what do I do? You have 4 weeks, you have 6 weeks. For example, right now, my own show is running 6 weeks ahead of schedule. There is so much more I can do when I'm not worried about what I was going to put out this morning in that case. So that's the number one thing I would say. Number two, when you go back, when you finish an episode, there's a couple other things you probably want to do right after you do it. It's a little bit tough to maybe partner with batch recording, but you can set aside some time, maybe the next day or something like that. But if you have episodes, you need to listen to them all the way through and have a notebook, have a little notebook in your mix with a couple timestamps. When does your show truly start? Where are the flubs in the show? Where are things that you just want cut out, screw ups, whatever it might be? And then where are the 2 to 3 like major amazing points that you can go through and say, man, that is a dynamite line right there. That should be on a poster. And that's what you make your show graphics out of and things like that. So those would be some of the standard operating procedures that I started before I even came to Sweetfish. And they're actually very much very similar to the processes that we use here at Sweetfish for all of our customers.
Dan, do you have anything? I know you've built a lot of processes whenever you first came on board. One standard operating procedure I'm thinking of is around guest outreach and just having even the scripting that you're going to use to get guests. I would say that part of that script to get guests needs to involve some level of customization for why you're asking them to be on the show. We used to just do a simple kind of like 1 or 2 sentence. It didn't have any really personalization in the email. And we just found that over time it became increasingly less effective. But whenever we tell the guest why we want them to be on the show, we still keep it brief. We try to keep it still 3 to 4 sentences in that outreach. But I think creating a standard operating process around what your guest outreach is going to look like, touch 1, touch 2, touch 3, maybe your first touch is on LinkedIn, maybe your second touch is email, maybe your third touch is a tweet. And having that documented so that it can be repeatable. But Dan, anything else outside of guest outreach that you can think of?
I've done a lot of guest outreach with people that I've just kind of like bumping into on LinkedIn. Like even today, someone messaged me and he's been the producer for the Art of Manliness podcast for 8 years and is growing it real large. And even though it's not B2B, I was like, dude, you want to be on the show? I'd love to learn from you, see what you've done, even though he's in B2C. So like that's happened organically, but now I'm actually systematically reaching out to guests that I'd love to have on the show. And not all of them are active on social media, but there's still an advantage to finding them on social media because I'd really like to do outreach through a channel where they're active, partly because it's easier for them to kind of like check out my profile, see that I'm like legit, right? Not just some weird person doing mass emailing them. But even then I can go and kind of creep on their profiles, look at them on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram, see that they're active on none of them, which is actually like I find is like 80% of the case. They post every once in a while, but they're not really active on social. It's probably because they're killing it in their work, at work, and then they go home, right? And that's okay. But still finding something on those profiles that you can reference to get them to want to be a guest on the show. And one, you use like hunter.io to find their email, right? Then you can email and be like, hey, I saw that you were into this. I'd love to talk to you about that on the show. That little personal, I saw that's going to make the huge difference in actually getting them to respond to your outreach.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily need to be from their personal profile either. It can be an observation of something that their company did.
Could be something like that.
Right. To pile right on top of that, Dan, this is a concept I introduced into my own show, which is about hunting for jobs and things like that. I call it micro networking because you're looking for that one piece of content that's probably on their LinkedIn page, probably somewhere in the social fabric of what that guest is. That is the literal Achilles heel to their heart to say, oh, you asked about this. Sure, I'll be on your show. I mean, it's really an interesting kind of thing where you can get very big buy-in from somebody by asking about the right thing.
All right. Anybody else have any thoughts on SOPs that they've developed, standard operating procedures that they've developed around their podcast that would be helpful?
Yeah, I kind of adding on to what James, you said, and Rob and Dan. I mean, that's what I call the planning phase, to be ready for the podcast. There's also the setup phase where you have to actually make sure you have the equipment, the tools, the right stuff. And there's also what you call the recording phase, when you make sure everything works, editing, all of that. And then afterwards, there's the production phase, the post-production phase, where you make sure the final checkups, I kind of actually used like a test team on social media where I could just send out like a demo version and get some live feedback. That could give you lots of inputs and ideas, and maybe identify some mistakes that you've done. And finally, of course, you've got the distribution and promotion phase. Yeah. Just like a set of phases that you constantly have to use to make sure that you have everything covered from start to scratch, from the end, start to end. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. That the way you broke it down in phases there, Navnis.
James, I was just going to throw something out there. I know that there's, depending on if they're working, with you guys, or, however people are doing their guest booking. I also attach a best practices document around, hey, here's how you're going to be on camera. Here's how the background should be set up, making sure they close out applications, how the format of the show works, links to past episodes so they can see how that works. And that just educates everybody. And I tell them, please read this 2 days in advance so they don't show up and then, not have something set up at the last minute. So that was another thing that's been pretty helpful for me.
That's great. I don't see Jeremy from our team on this call. I was just on a call with him before we jumped on here, but that's something that Jeremy spends a lot of time on with our customers, is making sure that our customers know how to best prep their guests to make sure that is a pretty common question I would say that we get is around, and I know we had this last week too, but around what kind of equipment does our customers' guests need to have? And we've found that, we don't send microphones to all of our customers' guests. That would get pretty crazy if you sent podcast equipment to everyone. But Dan, anything else related to what Ken just mentioned that comes top of mind for you around kind of the host and guest relationship? Any SOPs or processes that can streamline that?
I mean, there's quite a few, and it kind of depends on like what you're trying to get out of the episode, whether you're coming at it from an account-based marketing approach or just a general content marketing approach or a thought leadership approach. It kind of depends. There's nuances with all of them. So I'd kind of want to know when I'm meeting with customers, I'm kind of digging into the specifics in order to customize their approach on what's going to be their SOP.
Raj just asked a question in the chat. He said, would you recommend having guests sign a release? We get this. We should write a blog post on this, Emmy, because we get this a lot. I never request guests sign a release. I don't know if that's just because let me gather my thoughts on why. I think the biggest reason why I don't ask guests to sign a release is because I want there to be as little friction as possible between asking them to be on the show and actually getting to build a relationship with them and create content with them. And asking them to sign a release just feels like it's unnecessary friction. When someone is saying yes to being a guest on your show, they obviously know that it's content that you own and that you're going to be able to use that. So I guess I'm not real worried about the legal ramifications of what they would do. Knock on wood that nothing like that has ever happened with us or our customers. But if anybody else has a counter thought to that, I'm happy to hear somebody, make a case for why.
I can certainly see why, but at the same time, like I just got asked to sign a release this morning for another podcast as I was on. I'm like, I just feel like the release piece feels like official. It feels professional, but at the same time, I had a mentor tell me once, like, don't apply big business processes to smaller businesses. If you work for Google, then you should probably have a release because Google's got a big target on its head. They know there's lots of money there. If there's any random thing they can go after, like they'll go after you. So you kind of have to weigh like the liability and the risk associated with it. It's kind of going to be dependent on the type of people you're talking to, the types of things you're talking about. But generally in business to business, if your company's like startup or midsize even, it's kind of like, we're 2,000 episodes in, it hasn't been a problem. And a lot of our customers are much larger than us, and it hasn't, and not very few of them are doing it. And it hasn't been a problem in any of those cases. And we're publishing a ton of episodes beyond our own show every single week. But again, it's one of those things where like you have to consult your lawyer to see. Now, if you actually consult a lawyer, of course, they'll come up with 50 reasons why you should do it because they're lawyers and that's what they get to think about. But again, I don't think applying big business processes to smaller and medium-sized companies is a good idea.
Yeah. One of the things that I actually do for my own show is that I don't have a release per se, but I've had two kind of what's the best way to put it? Sort of like micro releases, if you will. One was in my guest form, like, hey, I agree to be on the show and not sue Rob if anything's going down the road, things like that. But the one that I really found was useful is I just roll it into the kind of the prep document that I send to my guests that says, hey, this is going to take about an hour and 15 minutes of your time as far as recording. And you know what? By agreeing to appear on the show, you hold me. You're basically giving me content is what it boils down to. And that's worked really well. Nobody's ever, with a couple companies I've been working with my show, nobody's ever turned up their nose to it or anything like that. Basically it's just to protect and make sure that I can always have an episode 17.
Yeah. I've found that at least with me, I because I'm in the podcasting space, obviously, and have been doing this for half a decade, I get asked to be on a lot of shows, and I just can speak from the guest's perspective as someone who gets asked to be on a lot of shows. Now, this isn't going to be the case for a lot of you because a lot of you are interviewing kind of industry experts where there's not a lot of shows in that industry, so they're not getting asked to be on a lot of shows. But from my perspective, the least amount of friction as possible that you're going to require of me to be on the show, the better. Chris Walker has mentioned this in a similar way on some content that I've created on LinkedIn around pre-interviews. Again, I'm a huge advocate for pre-interviews, but when you're talking to someone who's accustomed to doing a lot of media, a lot of podcast interviews, it ends up just kind of being annoying and not super helpful because they already know what they're going to say. They've written a book about it, or they're speaking on stages about it. But what you mentioned there, Rob, I think is super helpful for folks, especially if you're interviewing a lot of practitioners that are not on a lot of shows. I think they probably want that context, and they want to know more. They want to feel like they're really prepared going into it. This last question we've got 6 minutes left here. This last question is again one that we see a lot, and it's around it's specifically around are there any templates or things that you do to get guests to share and post the podcast on their channels or on their blog? This is something I've found, Dan, Rob, you all, or anybody else on this call, you might have some other thoughts here, but my take on this is I have just found it to be like pulling teeth, trying to get anyone to share your content. And I see a lot of podcasters make the mistake of intentionally going after influential people to be guests on their show because they think, oh, if I get Gary Vee on the podcast, he's going to share it with his channel and it's going to blow up my podcast. And I'm going to get all this new exposure, all these new listeners because Gary Vee shared my podcast. So they go and they interview Gary Vee and they do the Grant Cardone thing and they do all these other influencers. And to me, that strategy is flawed because people that have gained an enormous amount of influence online have done so by creating their own content. So there's not a lot of incentive for them to share your content when they've already got a machine behind them building their own content. The incentive, and they should be, right? They should be like they're incentivized to share their own stuff as opposed to sharing yours. And so I try not to, it's not that you should completely punt trying to get your guest to share the content that you create with them. I think if you do a nice, well-designed LinkedIn carousel deck, I think they're more likely to promote it. But I think, there are just, I don't think the strategy of the show and the audience growth tactic that is primarily deployed should be hinging on whether someone else promotes it, because it's an additional thing for them. and just after doing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these things, I've just seen time and time again, getting the guest to do anything with the content afterwards is not very doable. So instead, use that content that you create and repurpose from the show and have other people in your company share that content. So instead of just having them share a link to the episode, all of the different assets you create, micro videos, blog posts, carousel decks for LinkedIn, all these different media types, use it for evangelists on your team to use. This is something I want to get better at Sweetfish. And if the guest uses it, awesome. But if they don't use it, that content's not wasted because you've got other people on your team that are using that content to get the show out in front of as many people as you can. Dan, Rob, anybody else have any other thoughts there?
I would like to add something on that. I might be lagging here, but I'm not sure. What I used to do was whenever I actually finished an interview or a podcast show with someone, I would produce a short video snippet and just hand it over to them through email. And whether they share it or not, that's a plus. I mean, if they share it, it's a plus for me. If not, they can use it for something else. And trust me, they will use it for something else, because some of the people, they would like to show that, hey, I've been on this podcast show. I had some important things to do. Here's a little snippet of mine. Go and listen to it. And then afterwards, what I started doing was I started asking, do you want us to give you a short snippet, And then if it's a yes, I give it. If not, I don't give it. And it seemed to work for me.
That's a great point, Navnesh. I think asking them, you're going to save yourself a lot of time and effort, I think, in creating assets that never see the light of day. If you just ask them, hey, would you like us to create something? I know that there was one show that I was on, Growth Marketing Camp, with Rex Biberston, and they did a really well-designed LinkedIn slide deck for me, and I wanted to use it because as a content creator, I'm looking for content to create. I didn't have anything on a particular day, and I was able to go back and use that because it's a novel piece of content. If you can write, if you're really good at writing LinkedIn status updates, text-only status updates, that's something that me as a creator, like if it's well written and it's done well. Now, I would say that LinkedIn status updates are not usually done well, and so you have to make sure, like, okay, does my own content do really well on LinkedIn? If so, then I've clearly figured out something about the platform, and I can apply this ghostwriting for my guest content as well. But I think a lot of times the content that gets repurposed is just kind of like, I don't know, half-assed content. Honestly, it's not great. And because of that, the guest isn't going to be incentivized. I'll share a story though, real quick. One of our customers, he went to Gary Vee's office and actually interviewed Gary Vee. And because it was, a compelling piece of content, their videographer, D-Rock, was there. Gary Vee ended up doing a lot with the content that this particular customer recorded with him. And they did this whole little sketch. He went on a rant about like being Peter Pan or some character. And so their Gary Vee social team was able to do a lot with that little rant that Gary did on our customer show. So even Gary Vee, like having as much reach as he does, all the resources that he puts into creating content, used this guy's content, and I think made mention briefly that this was a part of the Cannonball Mindset podcast, but I still do not think that it moved the needle really hardly at all. If you were to look at this guy's podcast downloads prior to that happening and post, I think he would tell you that it wasn't a massive needle mover, and that was with Gary Vee, the guy who showed all of us how to do social well. Putting his entire engine behind promoting a particular clip from this guy's show. So I just think it goes to show that spending a lot of time trying to get someone else to share your content can be a fool's errand.
But don't forget to ask them. ask them anyway, but don't expect anything from it.
Yep.
Always ask.
That's the biggest thing. And I'm glad you said that, Rob. Ask, but don't expect. And I see a lot of people go in with expectations, and then they get pissed when the guest doesn't share it. And it's like, you don't want that to muddy up the relationship. That relationship with that guest could end up being incredibly strategic for you and your company. But if you've got bitterness toward them because they didn't share your episode, then it's like, who cares? Like, the relationship with that guest is significant, can be very significant. Don't get mad at them if they don't share it. People are busy. It's not their first priority. But we do get that question a lot. So I'm glad this one came up. We're at the top of the hour now. I've actually got I just saw that my next one-on-one jumped onto the line. So we got to jump off here, but thanks you all for joining, and we'll be back here again at 2:30 Eastern time next Wednesday. So we will see you all then.